Welcome to IB Biology. We're going to cover 5.2 natural selection. And I'm going to take a look at our questions to consider to start, and then we will go over some of the details. All right, so you need to be able to outline the principles of natural selection. So we're going to kind of look at those. You'll need to use those principles whenever you're talking about a specific example for natural selection. And you need to talk about how variation occurs within a species. That's something we've actually already talked about a bit with genetics. You have to be able to define the term adaptation. And you should be comfortable talking about evolution in terms of allele frequency. We'll hit that in quite a bit more detail, especially when we're doing 10.3 with HL, but SL, you should be familiar with that too. And then finally, we're going to look at two very specific examples for natural selection. One is we're going to outline the example of the finches on Daphne major in the Galapagos Islands. And then we're going to look at the evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Okay, so let's get started. So natural selection, and we have the definition of natural selection. It's a process in which organisms with certain inherited characteristics are more likely to survive and reproduce than are organisms with other characteristics. So essentially what's going on here is that there's some organisms that have traits that give them an advantage in their environment. And since they have that advantage, whether it's to get food or avoid predators, since they have that advantage, they will survive more frequently than ones that don't have that. And if they survive, they're more likely to reproduce, and their offspring will end up inheriting those characteristics, and so on and so forth. What we end up seeing if we have these selective pressures is that the allele frequency for the favorable characteristics, because we know that it's the phenotype essentially, right? So the allele frequency for that particular phenotype will increase in the population, in the gene pool, and the one that's not as favorable will start to decrease in the gene pool. So here's the principles of natural selection, and we're going to go over each one in detail. First, there has to be variation of characteristics within a species. Okay, so if there was only one allele and there was no variation, then nothing can be selected for. But if there's two or more alleles, then it's possible, if there's selective pressure, one of those alleles might be an advantage. So you have to have variation. Whenever you're given an example, you want to outline what is the variation, what trait, and what are the different variants. There has to be over-reproduction. There has to be more individuals are going to be born than will actually survive. And then, of course, because of that, we're going to have competition. And that competition is often due to limited resources, or it could be avoiding predators. We'll talk about that in general, called the selective pressure. So what is kind of driving, what is making that selection in which variation, which alleles are more beneficial. So that selective pressure, as I said, might be the lack, the type or amount of food that's available. It could be your ability to escape predators. You'll see when we're looking at bacteria and antibiotic resistance. So the selective pressure is the antibiotics. So the ones who can survive the antibiotics, they survive and reproduce. The ones who can't, those ones die. Okay. And then survival and reproduction of individuals with favorable characteristics. So these are the ones that have the adaptation in that particular environment. So if they have the right phenotype, then they're going to survive and reproduce in that environment. And then finally, their offspring have to be able to inherit it. So these characteristics have to be heritable. All right. So here's variation. We know that most populations have variation. If we're tracking evolution on just one gene, then there's got to be more than one allele. So there has to be some sort of variation within the population. And the sources of variation we know within populations are mutation, because all alleles are formed for mutation. We know the difference between like blood type A and blood type O is only one nucleotide difference, the same like making hemoglobin B in the normal shape versus making sickle cell. So that mutation is what allows a new allele to form. The mutation might be, detrimental, or it might be beneficial. So the mutation has to happen in a gene, and it has to be one that is beneficial for it to be able to survive in the population. So we've got mutation as one form, source of variation. And then also, because we know meiosis can create 2 to the 23rd different combinations of gametes, that also creates some variation within the population. Not everyone's the same. And then sexual reproduction. So you've got 2 to the 23 eggs, 2 to the 23 sperm. That's for humans, but other organisms have, plenty of chromosomes as well. So that will cause an even greater, like, does this sperm fertilize this egg? Does this sperm fertilize this egg? And so on. So there's a lot of different combinations. And that's why you don't look like your brothers and sisters. And that's why we can see this amazing variation in a lot of different species. Okay, over reproduction. All organisms actually produce more individuals that are going to survive in the environment. And that even goes for elephants. And because of that over reproduction, there's going to be competition for a limited resource or to avoid a predator. Okay. And so you need to talk about what is that selective pressure. So you should be able to say, what's the variation? You need to state that there's going to be over reproduction. Therefore, there will be competition for limited resources to avoid predators, some sort of selective pressure that you need to outline. And then you need to state that the survival and reproduction of individuals who have the favorable traits, those are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce. And we have a name for those traits, the ones that are beneficial, and that's called adaptations. So those are characteristics that make an individual suited to its environment and way of life. So I love this picture of the blue-footed boobies. If I was standing up, I would do a little dance, but they have these blue feet, and it's how they can attract mates. All right, and then finally, characteristics are heritable. So we know that parents will pass on those characteristics to their offspring because if it's genetics, that's how it works. So you need to make sure that you state that the offspring inherit the characteristics from the parents. And then over generation after generation after generation, if you're seeing only or more frequently some favorable allele, being passed on more frequently than another allele, then the genetic makeup of that gene pool is going to change over time. And if you remember, the definition of evolution is a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. Natural selection is just one way that can happen. It's the most common way we see in nature. There's other ways we can change the genetic makeup of a population due to natural disaster, migration, whatever that may be. But natural selection is the main mechanism for evolution. Okay, here is a really fascinating example on the Galapagos Islands. So we know that the Galapagos Islands is where Darwin did a lot of his research. And but there was a couple called Peter and Rosemary Grant, and they did a lot of their research on the Daphne Islands, kind of looking at some of these finches that Darwin had based his research off of. So we're going to look at their example and their study. But just to give you an idea, there was a common ancestor that landed on the Galapagos Islands, and look at the diversity of finches and beak sizes that resulted from that. We are going to focus on these ones down at the bottom, see if I can show you a little bit better, but these ground finches, and this medium ground finch, Geospiza fortis, is an important species that they had studied on the island of Daphne Major. And we'll introduce the small ground finch and then this large ground finch in the discussion as well. Okay, so here's Daphne Major is on one of these islands here. It's a little tiny. And on Daphne Major, the medium ground finches, they had a really wide range of beaks. So they had very large beaks and they had small beaks. And they could do that because on Daphne Major, there was an absence of the small ground finch. On the other islands, the medium ground finch actually exists with the small ground finch. And so most of the medium ground finches on the islands, if they have to compete with a small ground finch, have that larger beak. It's, we've already looked at the idea of resource partitioning. And so when they're on an island, when medium ground finch, so G. fortis, when they're on an island with the small ground finch, they tend to have larger beaks. But on Daphne Major, they had a really wide range of beak sizes. They have these small little guys and then the bigger ones. And the reason why the small ones can exist is because they can eat a whole bunch of these little soft seeds that are easy to get to. They don't have to spend a lot of energy. Now, the small seeds don't have as much energy as big giant seeds, but they can eat a whole bunch of them and eat them really quickly. Well, the ones that have larger beaks, they could eat the small seeds, but they're also capable of getting into these really large hard seeds, which are called the tribulus seeds. And so these guys had a wider range of food, but they don't have to compete for the small ones if they can keep eating these, larger seeds. And their beaks are big enough to break these open. These small little beaks here, they cannot break open the tribulus seeds. All right, and so the Grants were studying these, the population of these, and they kept track of how many, large beaked and small beaked ones there were. And then they noticed that in 1977 there was a drought. And so here's the mean beak size, right? And they were 0 just means that that's kind of like what they would look like, when they first got there. And, we'd see some smaller beak sizes, but then all of a sudden there was a drought in 1977. And that drought meant that all of the plants that made the small, softer seeds, like the plants didn't live. And so there weren't a lot of small seeds. And they started to see these small beaked finches that were, they saw the smaller beak variety of the medium ground finch disappear. But the larger beaked ones were able to eat more tribulus seeds, which were, hanging around from years before. And so they still had a food source. And so you saw that in recovery from that drought, a lot of these ones died, but the larger beaks, they did better. So just looking at this range where we saw this huge uptick in the size of the beaks is the part of the natural selection that you need to really be able to talk about. And so if you were talking about this, you'd want to say, hey, there's variation in beak size, right? And that there was more finches, especially because of the drought, that were born than were going to be able to survive. And then there's the selective pressure. All of a sudden, the selective pressure was competition for a food source. There wasn't very much food in the softer, smaller seed range. And so the individual finches that had the adaptation or the characteristic of this larger beak, they survived. And since they could survive, they reproduced. And they passed on that larger beak gene. Therefore, we see a higher frequency of this gene in the population. Now, as time went by and there wasn't a drought, we saw more and more of the small beak varieties, start to still be successful and so on. And then somewhere around in here, another bird, this large ground finch, that one came, it's a different species, and that one came to the island and actually was driving a lot of this competition of the beak size because they could eat the big giant seeds. And so we actually saw that dropping in beak size, less than normal. And then there was a drought, and that drought actually caused a severe reduction in their numbers. Now, you don't need to be able to talk about this on an exam. You just need to be able to focus on this big shift going from kind of normal or smaller beaks shifting to the big ones. But it's interesting to see that the drought this time in 2004 actually caused a major drop in beak size because there was this competition from the large ground finch. And so these guys were getting all of the tribulus seeds, and the larger beaked medium ground finches just couldn't compete. So these guys went extinct, and these smaller ones were able to just eat up any of the remaining food. But altogether, their populations declined significantly in that year. Okay. The last example you need to be able to do is the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And in this case, we know that if bacteria can reproduce really quickly, and because it can reproduce really quickly, mutations occur pretty frequently. And so if someone were to get infected with a bacteria, say tuberculosis or something, the bacteria is going to reproduce within that individual, reproduce, and there's probably bound to be mutations that exist within the population. So a few of those might be born with that. So the variation is, in this case, going to be the ability to survive a particular antibiotic. So here we've got some mutation in DNA, and this is the variation here. There hasn't been selective pressure yet because this person is sick. And so let's say they go to the doctor and they get a course of antibiotics. And they start taking those antibiotics. Now, at this point, the antibiotics are the selective pressure. The antibiotics did not cause the mutation. They are the selective pressure. The mutation just happened normally in the population because bacteria will mutate because they, pretty easily because they reproduce so quickly. All right, so this person got sick. They get some antibiotics, which is now the selective pressure. And the antibiotics are going to kill off all the individuals that don't have the mutation to survive the antibiotics. So maybe you got penicillin or, amoxicillin or something like that. And now, usually, if you complete the entire course of antibiotics, even these guys won't be resistant enough and they'll eventually die. But a lot of people often feel a lot better after they take a couple days of antibiotics and they're like, oh, I feel better. I'm not going to take any more. And so they stop. And then these guys don't end up actually dying. And so then these guys are the ones that have the trait. They survive, they reproduce, and all of their offspring are clones unless there's another mutation. And this is a much more drug-resistant bacteria. So they're going to multiply and thrive. And so if you were to take that same antibiotic again while you're still infected, it might not work as well. So it's really, really important that you realize that the antibiotic is the selective pressure and not the mutagen. The thing that causes the mutation is not, that's just the fact that, with bacteria reproducing really quickly, they're going to have mutations, and some of those mutations might make it an advantage for them to survive. Now, sometimes bacteria can actually pass their genes from one to another because they have these little extra plasmids. And if the mutation is in a plasmid, they can reproduce that plasmid and give it to another bacteria. But for the most part, it's just we think about the mutation because bacteria reproduce quickly and they naturally will have a lot of variation within their genetic code. And so because of that mutation, then when you introduce the selective pressure of the antibiotic, if that mutation makes them resistant to it, these ones are more likely to survive. It's also why it's really important to take an entire course of antibiotics. And in fact, we do have bacteria now that are resistant to multiple different antibiotics. We call those multiple resistant strains, so MRSs. And it's really dangerous if someone gets infected with a bacteria like that because there's not so many drugs to actually be able to combat that. So they take a lot of care of that when they're in the hospital because that's where those different pathogens tend to get spread around. Okay, so there's the examples. And I just want to do a quick summary of natural selection before we sign off. First of all, it's a process with individuals that have certain heritable characteristics survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals, right? And so those heritable characteristics that give them an advantage are called adaptations. We know that natural selection can increase the match between organisms and their environment. And that's why, we see these flightless cormorants starting to, develop over time because they're really good at getting what they need for their food and survival. And if an environment will change, or if individuals move to a new environment, there might be different selective pressures, right? So natural selection can result in different adaptations. So just because an adaptation exists in one place, because if it's an advantage, doesn't mean that same trait will be an adaptation or advantageous in another location. So, so that's why we see if you get a smaller population move to a new place, when we're looking at speciation, it's going to have different selective pressures, and those different selective pressures can arise in speciation. Some important points to consider is that individuals do not evolve. You can only pass on heritable traits from organisms to their offspring. And it's always operating, but which traits are favored is going to depend on the environmental conditions. Okay, so that's the end, and hopefully you are able to answer these questions.